Hi guys, we're in chapter 11 again, which we're dealing with the cost that a person has with owning their own home. And today in 11.3, we're dealing with utilities and the electricity part of it, okay? So with the electricity, a homeowner can actually determine what their electric bill is going to be pretty close to what it's going to be before they receive the bill, okay? And by looking at the meter that's attached to their house. Now, the meters that we have in our book is a little different than what a lot of you probably have. Within the last few years, they've come out with smart meters, which are all done digitally, which send a signal back to the electric company. The meters that we have in our textbook are all dealt with dials. Some of you still might have those if they haven't come out and made the change yet, but we're going to go ahead and use, and so that we can understand what our books is talking about here. Okay, so when we're talking about electricity, electricity is measured, measures the consumption, and it uses the measurement called kilowatt hours. Okay, so a lot of times we use the term kilowatt, which simply means there's 1,000 watts that are used. So when we talk about kilowatt hours, what it really is talking about is that we use 1,000 watts in 1 hour of electricity. Is all that's simply talking about. When I use 1,000 kilowatt hours, it says I've used 1,000 watts in that hour. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's talk about this, how in your book the meter that they used has, okay? So in the old-fashioned, we'll call it that, electricity meters, they had a one disc that would spin, and it spun in a proportion to the speed that you were using, okay? So if you weren't using much, the disc would move pretty slow. When you're using everything in your house, you would see that disc moving a lot faster. When that big main disc spun, it would also trigger multiple other discs, little discs that would measure your units, and it would give you a reading. So in your book, the meter has 5 different mini discs. And so every time you use a watt, it would flick over one of these discs and it would keep adding up, and it was by tens. Okay, so when you're reading the unit, you'd read those small discs from left to right, and the left side would be the biggest unit, the place value that you would have, okay? So it basically would be like a 10,000 with a 5 circle disc here, okay? This is how, with old cars, that's how they would do an odometer reading, was you'd have a main central disc that would trigger smaller discs to measure how many miles you went. So we don't do that now. With technology, it's gotten digital, but that's how we use to measure electricity and miles in a car. So let's go ahead with our example here, okay? Our power company takes these measurements once a month, basically about 30 days apart. And so what they do is simply take the difference between the reading that they did from the previous reading, and they'll tell them how much energy you used within that month. So here we go. Here's our example, okay? Basically, to do this example, we have to understand Table 11.2. Table 11.2 is on page 411 of your textbook here. It is basically a table they're using Southern Power Company for an example here, but this table is broken up into 5 different columns. The 4 columns here that we're using tells about the different types of house construction you have. Are you an energy efficient house? Maybe not so efficient. Do you use electric heat or gas water heater? And if you notice below the terms there are some codes, RE1, RE2. You will see these used in your homework examples, and it's referring to the type of house that you have. Now, this first column here talks about a fixed rate, the first 350 and over 350. Your energy, the electric company uses 350 kilowatt hours as their dividing line. Everyone has to pay a fixed charge for the month, but anything over 350 has a different dollar rate that they use for measurement. So we will be using this table throughout our homework assignment here. Okay, now let's go on to our example. Our example here is for May 22nd. Okay, it has a meter reading of 32,095. It's for an energy efficient house. On June 23rd, the electric company comes out and it measures it and does, they've used 32,920. They want us to find the consumption for the month charge and the cost per day. So the very first thing we have to do is figure out how much energy we used. So we're going to simply take the second reading that they did on June 23rd, and we're going to subtract our first reading from May 22nd. That's going to tell us how much energy we used, 825 kilowatt hours. Now remember that 350 is that dividing line. So we need to go ahead and take that 825 and subtract 350. That's going to be 475 kilowatt hours we have to use at the higher rate. Okay, so now they want us to find out what the cost is. So what we're going to do is take that 350 times it by the cost for that first 350, and that's in the chart on page 411. Then we're going to take that extra 475 and multiply that by the cost for the over usage of 350. Do the multiplication, you get these for their totals. The one last thing is you've got to add that fixed charge that everyone has to pay for that. Once you add all of those together, you get the cost in step 3 of $64.29. Okay, we're not done with the problem yet because they want us to find out the cost per day. Okay, so that means step 4, we've got to figure out how many days we actually used. So this is when we have to go back to page 567 in our textbook. We use this back on chapter 3 or 4 of our textbook, and it's called the serial table. This gave us the exact days. So when I'm talking about May 23rd, remember I go down to the day of the month and find 23. I follow it across until I get to May, and I find out that it's 143 days. Okay, and then we're talking about June 23rd. My finger's still on 23rd, but I'm just going to go over to June and I get 174. These are the numbers that I'm going to use for finding the days of usage. So I'm going to take my June total, subtract my May total, and we're talking about 32 days that this meter reading is covering. Okay, now that I know the amount of days, we're going to take the cost that I just found, and I'm going to divide it by 32. This is going to give me my cost per day of using the electric. Okay, so for these types of problems, I got to find out how much was my bill, and then I got to find out how many days that bill truly covered, and then divide them out. Okay, let's do another example here. Okay, we're going to actually talk about our individual appliances here, okay? Now, last chapter, when we were looking at different appliances, we talked about that yellow tag that told us how much kilowatt hours of energy that it used. And this is where it comes into play. So, if an appliance says it uses 100 watts, that means that it is using energy. And when we talk about kilowatt hours, we're using 100 watts in that 1 hour. Now, in real life, we don't tend to use appliances for a continuous hour. Let's use a hair dryer, okay? You don't stand there for a complete hour and dry your hair, or your hair would look like a haystack, okay? You might use it for 5 minutes, okay? So we're going to take that 5 minutes of usage time, and we're going to divide it by 60 minutes because there's 60 minutes in an hour. We're talking about everything in hours time. So once I get my fraction 5 over 60, I'm then going to multiply it by whatever watt that appliance used. Here in the example, we were talking about 100 watts. Your appliance might be 650, so you would multiply it by 650, whatever the watt of that appliance is. Okay, so let's do an example here, okay? So in the example, it says find the number of kilowatt hours used per month. Remember, we talk about a month being 30 days. I know there's some days that are 31, but for calculations terms, we use 30 days here. So find the number of kilowatt hours used per month if a freezer runs 12 hours a day and it's rated at 746 watts. Okay, if you notice, they gave us watts. We're not talking about kilowatt hours yet, okay? So we're going to need to do some work with that. So the very first thing I'm going to do is simply take that amount of watts and I'm going to multiply it by the days and hours here. And I need to do some converting to get from days to hours. So in our problem, it says it runs for 30 days. And I know from our example up above, it says a day is really 12 hours, not 24 hours. It runs 12 hours. So I'm going to take my fraction for converting, put days in the bottom and hours up on top. Okay, my days cancel out. I'm 2 hours here where I need to be. And so then all I'm going to do is simply multiply all of it out together. And once I convert it, I find that it's 268,560 watts. Okay, and we're dealing with hours, watt hours here. Okay, but we're talking watt hours, not kilowatt hours. So what do I need to do? I need to go ahead and convert it to kilowatt hours. Remember at the beginning we talked about kilowatts being 1,000. So all I need to do is take that total we got and simply divide it by 1,000. This will convert it to kilowatts hours. Okay? It looks very confusing at the very beginning, but it's simply just multiplying, converting from days to hours, and then once I get that total, divide it by 1,000 to get kilowatt hours. Okay, let's take a moment here and let's look at our homework assignment here, and let's see how we do. The first problems are simply looking at how to read a meter, okay? And so they gave you some dials. Here they have given you 4 dials. And so you're going to read it from left to right. Remember, the left dial is your highest place value. Okay? The next problem, once you read it, you'll see that it says 8,135. Okay, problem number 2. 2, 3, and 4 are all with reading the dials. Okay, we're going to look at problem number 5. Problem number 5 says calculate the power usage in kilowatt hours and the month's charge. So the very first thing I need to do is find out how much was used. Okay, so in problem 6, they give you a chart and it says previous and present. All you're going to simply do is take the present meter reading and subtract the previous. That's going to tell you how much usage you used. And it was 1,837. Now remember, we have that dividing line of 350. So I'm going to take that amount and subtract 350 from it. That's going to tell me how much extra I used. And here in this case, it was 1,487 kilowatt hours. Okay, so now that I have my totals, now I can go ahead and actually look at the cost. So remember, in our example, we're going to use, it says in that chart, RS1. So that means on table 11.2, I have to go to the column that says RS1 and use those totals. So I have $787, which is my fixed rate that everyone has to spend. Here's my 350. I'm going to multiply it by the charge. And then here's my extra, and I'm going to multiply it by that charge. Multiply them out, add the totals up, and you find that you've got $141.27. Okay, so that's what you're going to do problems 5 through 10. You need to get those totals because you're going to use the totals for the last problems here. Problems 11 through 16 are using those totals, and they want us to find the cost per day. So to find the cost per day, I'm looking at problem 11. It's dealing with Morgan here, and it gives us the dates from and to. So we're going to use the dates. Remember, we always want to use the last date first. So we're going to go back to our page on in the back of the book, 567, and we're going to look up July 23rd, get that total, which was 204, and subtract the day for June 23rd. Okay, subtract them out, and we find that our pay period there was actually 30 days for this electric bill. I'm going to take the total that I just found in problem 5 and divide it by the 30 days for this month. Once I divide it out, that gives me the cost of $4.71 per day. That's what they're looking for, okay? Now, our last two problems are story problems. They're taking real life situations and seeing if you can interpret from a chart and back and forth here. Problem 17, once you read it out, you're going to notice that it is exactly like problem 11. Okay, so follow the steps that we just did for problem 11 and you should be fine with that. Problem 18 is asking for the taking the cost and finding the rate for it. Okay, so you're gonna simply, with that, they give you a total, and if you notice, that total is including a fixed rate. For this problem, we don't want that fixed rate included, so we had the very first step is to subtract that fixed rate out of the total. Once you get that total, then divide it by the rate per kilowatt hour, and you'll find that you have your answer. Okay, read the tables very carefully, and you should have no problem with this section. If you have any questions, email or text me. Have a good day, guys.